Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about Module 1, Topic 2, and you're with me, Rochelle, and Tom. Again, we're very excited to be here. First thing we're going to talk about is historical context, and Tom's sort of Tom, I was going to say expert, but Tom would be the first person to say he's not an expert because we believe that once you think you're an expert, you stop learning, and Tom will never stop learning. So he's not an expert, but he knows a lot.
Right.
So
Right.
we'll go with that.
Right.
Okay, Tom, talk to us about where school began. So you guys, let me just give a little, this is going to be, some of this will be super basic. You've heard it before. We're going to kind of talk a little bit quickly through it. And some of it you might be like, oh, I had no idea. And so if you already knew this stuff, we're really sorry, but hopefully we'll bring some new information to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So schools kind of were community driven for a long time. It was a group of parents that would get together and say, we want to have a school for our kids. And they would find someone who was usually a traveling educator that would move from city to city looking for a job. And they would operate what we today would call a one-room schoolhouse. It's mixed grades. It's usually anything from kindergarten up to 8th grade, and the parents would pay a tuition to have their children in this one room schoolhouse. And this was kind of the norm for a long time
So
until
basically we've come full circle with the micro school model.
very much so. Yes, very much so. Really, it was with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that the idea of standardizing education for everyone came about. And the timing isn't identical, but it's very similar, with public education systems starting really in Massachusetts and kind of the New England area in the United States. And even then, it was still kind of a one-room schoolhouse model. It was really only as they started creating mandatory education laws or compulsory education laws that they were telling everyone to go to school, that now they start sorting by grade level, by ages, and now there's kind of a standardized curriculum based on what the ages are and what grade the student is in.
Wait, so when they made it compulsory, did they also fund it?
In many places, the funding came later. They didn't
So
come
they
right
made
away.
it, they're like, you have to go to school and you're gonna have to figure out how to pay for it.
Right, right. In some places, it happened at the same time. It's really the education transformation was across a spectrum of probably about 40 years from the 1850s into the late 1880s. Um, but then what happened is around the turn of the 20th century, you have some education revolutionaries. This is where you have the people who really are promoting the ideas of a progressive society. And this is where folks like John Dewey come in, who are really rethinking education for the first time, um, and trying to understand how people learn and what they do. And this is where school starts to really separate itself out from the rest of society. School becomes its own entity, its own institution that is no longer like it's this weird standalone thing, and you create this whole culture around school. Um,
So
and
up
so,
until that point, would you say school, like the shift was school was a privilege to the people that could pay for it and find a teacher, and then now it's a like this is an everybody thing?
yeah, very much. There's a few interesting exceptions to this, though, and I know we had planned to talk about some of these like smaller education programs, um, where schools were still very heavily segregated, right?
Mm.
In fact, in many
Mhm.
places, it was only white children who were even able to attend the schools. So you had some smaller education programs like the Rosenwald schools that were designed specifically for the children of former slaves. Uh, these were kids who were often excluded from the
Mhm.
programs, from the education programs in their communities. And when I say often, I mean that was the norm until the 1950s, right? Until Brown v. Board of Education. But people found that if they could build small schools in their local communities to serve specific populations, it was transformational, it was revolutionary. And we saw that kind of trend on a smaller scale happen well into the 60s, 70s. Um, and it's developing a bit of a resurgence today where you have these big institutionalized programs with federal decision making, No Child Left Behind, some of these other federal programs that promise one thing, but then what they deliver isn't always that, mostly because of the scale at which they're trying to do things. But communities don't operate at the federal scale.
Yeah.
Communities operate at the local scale, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to operate schools at the local level really puts the hands back into the community to be able to meet the needs of the community. So again, we saw some of that in the 60s with some radical, what they called the democratic free schools, which brought some really cool innovations. They weren't very well received because they were often tied to very specific political ideologies that were not well received by people at the time. But as far as education goes, they were a really revolutionary model.
Like ahead of the game.
Right. Well, I was just going to say, then again, moving into kind of some more innovative education models like the Sudbury model, and you can't do those on a national scale or at the federal level. They tend to happen at the community level with some people who are just trying to find better education programs for their kids locally.
And I think a lot of times the challenge is that really cool models like that aren't compatible with the requirements, with the government requirements for schools. Like that's the super tricky part, is you want to be really innovative, but there's all these hoops, and it's like, how much innovation can you have and still jump through all the hoops?
Right. So the part of the compulsory education laws that followed, federal court ruled several times that education had to be free access to everyone, and it had to be equal, meaning everyone had access to the same education. Well, equal meant standardized, and standardized went from equal opportunity initially to targeting equal outputs. The idea being that if we thought everyone was equal and we gave them equal opportunity, then equal outputs would follow. And that's not necessarily the case, right?
Well, especially because it wasn't delivered with equality either.
Clearly, right.
Obviously.
Right. And so treating people equal under the law is very different than giving people equal opportunities under legal frameworks. This gets us into the idea of procedural due process versus substantive due process. And I don't want to get too much into constitutional law theory here, but is school something that needs to be procedurally equal, meaning we give everyone access to the same tools, or substantively equal, meaning we give people the tools they need with their tools and their skill sets to be able to reach the same standard?
And I could see that being argued both directions pretty effectively with,
Right.
A lot of like arguing the same thing on either side of that.
Right, exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about moving forward, the charter school and school choice movement, which I think very early 90s in a few places, and then into the 2000s in more places. That was kind of the timing. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the current school choice movement was really kind of resurged in the 90s. There's some very early stuff back in the 50s. Ironically, it was the segregationists who were trying to there's a big narrative that the segregationists were trying to invoke school choice, but there were also several very influential people who were trying to use school choice as a way to speed up desegregation of schools. So it went both ways, but that was really the racial tensions of the 50s and 60s were kind of the big push for school choice back then.
Interesting.
Now that's not the same case. Now it tends to be more along the lines of different types of curriculum, different theories of instruction. Sometimes it's different kinds of character-based education, where you want to see more values-driven education. So it's a lot of that
Tell
stuff.
me if I'm wrong, but charters were started typically. The idea was before then, this was sort of before there were really big organizations running lots and lots of charters over the, which EMO is and CMO, charter management organization, educational management organizations. So before those really big ones, really it was a group of parents got together and wanted something different for their kids. That was the like vision of charter schools initially, wasn't it?
Yeah, generally speaking, it was parents who were kind of already operating as a private school,
Mm.
but without any legal framework under which to operate
Or funding.
or funding. Right. And so this was supposed to be a gateway to both of those things. Has the idea of charter schools delivered on that promise? Maybe not. In some cases, it's certainly created more opportunities. In some cases, it has underdelivered. But what it has done, and to me, this is the most important thing that it could have done in the beginning, is open up the conversation of who gets to decide what's best.
Mm-hmm.
And with that question, I think the charter schooling movement and really kind of a resurgence in the homeschooling movement that we've seen much more recently. Um, I know some of the long-term homeschoolers are laughing at me for saying that.
I was homeschooled in the early 80s, and we were the weird kids in a small rural town in Arizona. So I get it.
Right, right. Um, and I was a member of one of the earliest graduating classes of a charter high school in Arizona. Um, so a lot of different opportunities for education there, but the idea was, did it actually make the change that it was promising to change?
Mm.
Maybe not. Did it
And
create?
especially when you look at what does school look like?
Right.
I think that's the part. And obviously I'm biased toward micro schools, in favor of micro schools.
Sure.
And that's where I see like micro schools like completely change the dynamic. It's no longer a like direct instruction to 30 kids in a classroom. It's obviously all the things that we'll talk about as we're going through this course. But and I would say the charter school and school choice movements are a big reason why micro schools are, it's a progression. And I think
Right.
the micro school movement can thank some of the things that have happened in particularly the school choice movement, and the idea that parents, to your point of who gets to be making these choices, that parents can be making choices for your children. So that's it's such an interesting history and pattern and path, especially when you pointed out at the beginning of this video that it all started in micro school.
And there's a couple interesting things that I want to touch on, in that charter schools changed the content of schooling, but they didn't necessarily change the design of schooling itself as an institution. And I want to bring up two important thinkers, Clayton Christensen and Carol Dweck, who pushed ideas back in the 90s and early 2000s, or really kind of mid 2000s, that challenged us as educators to reshape the design of school, or the design of the institution. And both publicly funded schools and charter schools really kind of failed to deliver on this. So with Clayton Christensen, he wrote a book. I used to be able to reach over and grab it off my bookshelf. I've loaned it out to someone, it's long gone. But the book is called Disrupting Class. And for him, it was about how this promise of technology was supposed to revolutionize the way we educated kids. And instead, what we did is we took computers and we tried to plug that technology into an existing institutional design that, in his view, was very monolithic. And the technology didn't deliver on what it was promised to do. Why? Because we didn't change the way we were educating kids. We simply changed the tools we were using. Same thing now with Carol Dweck. Her approach was very different. Her approach was all about the mindset and the process of education. She's well known for a growth mindset. I actually can reach out and grab her book, but because I didn't do it for Professor Christensen's book, I won't do it for Professor Dweck's book. But the idea for her was all about this concept of a growth mindset, where you have to allow kids to try, fail, try again, fail again, try again, fail again. evaluate that process, and that process was going to develop things like educational grit, resilience in kids, and that those things didn't translate very well into grades, but that they were some of the most critical things that
Yeah.
people needed to be successful as a lifelong educator.
The
And
trickiest part of putting that into the current system is, I mean, there's a lot of tricky parts to this, but one of them is once you like, you look at our grading system, like you have X amount of time to cover X amount of like this content, you get X percentage right on it. And in our world, failing is the worst thing you can do in school. In my
right,
opinion, if you're learning from your failures, it's kind of the only way to grow. And people talk about the analogies of like kids learning to walk, that is as sort of the most basic one. But there's not a readdressing, like when a kid fails in school, meaning they don't like get the right answer, there isn't really, generally speaking, an opportunity to go back and learn from it. Like you turn in homework, you get 75% of it right, you take it back, and you never like reconsider the parts you didn't get. And I think that's one of the really, because the growth mindset piece is amazing, but to
right,
your point, there's no room for it in the system.
right. And I saw that as an educator. I came into the world of education right about the time that Dr. Dweck published her book. Uh, and it was very cool. They tried to bring in a bunch of professional development folks and teach us all about these concepts of growth mindset. And after 3 or 4 years of trying to plug that square peg into the round hole of the institution of school, they said, this doesn't work. And they tossed it all out. When the reality was, she was asking us to redesign the institution of schooling itself because that research proved so critical. The
Mm-hmm.
same thing Dr. Christensen was doing. And schooling in general has been too large to be able to do that. Throw on top of that the federal legislation like No Child Left Behind and the Common Core state standard or education standards, and this idea of standardization. And this is not what school looks like. This is not what learning looks like. And so for me, the premise and really the promise of micro schools is the flexibility to do all of those things while still getting creative with assessment and
Mm-hmm.
some of these other tools to really say, no, we can do this. We can use a growth mindset. We can change the way we do instruction, and we can still deliver on these promises because we were willing to change the design of the institution.
Totally. So I have said this a lot, and it's controversial, I think, in some ways, but I always say that, you have this system, and there are variations, but it's pretty much the same thing. So you have this system, and you put every kid in the system, and if that student's way of learning doesn't align with the system, by the end we're like broken kid, broken kid, broken kid, never considering that maybe the system is broken for some kids. And I'm not going to say it's broken for all kids, but it's this very infuriating experience to watch kids one after the other be damaged by the very environment that is supposed to be nurturing them.
Right.
That's to me one of the, like, it's kind of egregious that is happening again.
Yeah, we have this weird idea that we can take non-homogeneous human beings, stick them into a homogeneous system, and get homogeneous outputs in terms of a workforce. And that really was kind of the premise of schooling altogether, was to
they
create
talk about that, the
standardized outputs.
bells. Yeah, when the whole world wanted to be factory workers, this was a really great way to get them ready for that. Yeah.
Right.
No, yeah. Okay, so I have a question for you along the lines of, we're going to shift gears a little bit, the legal landscape.
Right.
How do we know we can even do this? And it'll kind of depend on, I mean, we're at Grand Canyon, and we're specifically talking, which is in Arizona. And so there's a lot of talk in Arizona about this. So I think the answer will vary state by state, but how do we know that we can do this, meaning have micro schools?
Right. So great question, because again, this is a shifting area. Same way that parents were kind of self-organizing into private schools previously, and the program of charter schools created this opportunity, legislation is kind of a lagging indicator on this, as parents were kind of self-organizing into homeschool cooperative learning pods. And then with the pandemic shutting schools down, the learning pods, and quite honestly, parents weren't asking the question, can we legally do this? They were just doing it. And no one was pushing too hard on that.
Because nobody had solutions.
Right, because no one had a better alternative.
Yeah.
So the legislation is kind of a lagging indicator in many places. Well, let me first start by saying homeschooling is legal in all 50 states in the United States. And that is, in many places, the legal construct under which microschools operate.
Okay.
In some places, there are states that actually have caps on the number of families that can cooperate together before they say, no, you're a private school, you have to register as a private school.
Well, and I think in some states, homeschooling is really challenging. Like
Right.
Arizona is it's affidavit of
Right.
homeschooling. You turn in a paper to the state or to the county superintendent, and as a parent, you're saying, I'm going to educate my child, and the state really doesn't do anything to confirm that that's the case. In some
Right.
states, there is a lot more. There are things you have to do annually to evidence that you are actually educating your child. Arizona doesn't have that.
Correct. So I will just say, in Arizona, there are actually several legal mechanisms by which you can form a microschool or a kind of informal homeschool pod. Check your local laws state by state, and when in doubt, consult someone who has legal expertise.
Let's talk about what does the law require of microschools? And we just talked about this. Is there anything you want to add to that, or do you feel like that was?
Yeah, I think a big part of this is when parents are looking at choosing a school, and then the school operators, even the micro school operators, if you're operating a public school, there are legal requirements that you have to see to, especially in terms of special education, especially in terms of
Attendance.
attendance, but also meeting the needs of the students. If you are accepting certain sources of funding, then there's also serving meals and a handful of other things that you are required to do, either by virtue of your existence or because you're taking certain pools of money to operate your school. I would make the argument that for micro schools in particular, even though those things are not legally required, unless you have some kind of contractual obligation to do so, that there's still a moral impetus to do those things, to deliver those services, especially as we're working with Grand Canyon here, and really catering to the needs of the Christian community. I would say for us, it's even stronger that we have a higher calling to ensure that people are served as individuals, that people's needs are met, that we meet people where they are, whether that's in meeting their physical needs, meeting their emotional needs, and then meeting their educational needs after those other needs are met.
So legal obligation, not a lot.
Right.
Moral obligation. And I would say on top of that piece, we have this really unique moment in Arizona with the universal ESA, and we'll talk more about that.
Right.
That is literally the rest of the country is looking at, because we have the best funded, most expansive ESA law in the country. And it's our responsibility to make sure that ESA program is used in ways that are like legal and legitimate. And like, we really have a responsibility in Arizona to set the standard for I guess we should say we have the responsibility and the opportunity to kind of set the standard. And it's really easy to be opposed to the ESA. There's a lot of reasons that people have to being opposed to the ESA, and people using ESA, doing that really, really well, serving students that don't normally have choice, that don't normally have opportunities like this. Like, that's a massive part of this to me.
right. And that us being good stewards of the resources and opportunities that
Mhm.
we have will help those opportunities expand, not just into other parts of the country, but honestly into other parts of the world. If we
Mm.
can show how this can be done effectively, you know, so we have that obligation to be good stewards with the resources that we have access to, so that we don't steal those opportunities from others down the road.
Totally. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about before we end this. Um, the topic is the shifting role of school. Um, are we asking schools to do too much? And I think there's a lot of nuance to these
Yeah.
answers, because in a lot of situations, school is school is necessary. Like the public school system, how it is a necessity for parents who need to be, supporting their families. Like when you think about the sort of intentionally repressed parts of our society, there's not a lot of opportunity for considering, or time for considering what education options there are for kids.
Right.
I might have gone on a total tangent there, but go ahead and talk about that a little bit, or talk about
No,
sort
I
of
think
like school's job.
you're absolutely right. The legal doctrine exists called in loco parentis, meaning schools are able to act in the place of the parents, not just during the school day, but anytime that the student is under the care of school officials. Now, that gives school educators,
Where did that right
mm,
come?
yeah,
Do you know?
I don't know where that doctrine originated from, but it is universal in the United States. Um, the premise behind that is, well, if a child gets hurt, do we have the legal right to
Mhm.
treat that child? Like, can we call 911 on their behalf? If we don't give the educator some kind of rights to act as an agent of the child, then a whole bunch of bad things happen. And but this has expanded over the years from emergency medical needs and educational services to all kinds of medical and social and emotional services as well. Every single one of these, from my perspective, is growing out of a need where kids are coming to school with unmet needs
Mm, mhm,
that prevent the learning from taking place, right? And I don't want to like lay the blame at the feet of the parents, because often they are without the means
mhm.
to meet those needs themselves. um, but within our society we've placed all of
So like
this.
free and reduced lunch,
Right.
breakfast and lunches is a huge, that's a part of that.
Absolutely.
When you think about the micro school, so again, I think there's a little bit of misnomer when we use the word micro school, but we say it's not a school because it doesn't, because typically schools meet ADA requirements, they
Right.
provide food, all of these things. So just be aware of, there is that that like situation that we have. But thinking about, as you think about building your micro school, and I'm talking to the people that are listening to us, not you, Tom, um, the socioeconomic considerations that you may or may not need to think about or include, but it is really helpful to just consider it. Is transportation needed? Is
Right.
nutrition needed? We were talking about, and these are the things that schools are legally required to
Mhm. To address any.
offer. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, home safety, being a mandatory reporter. And so I think, as we continue down this road of micro schools, background checks are a really good idea.
Right.
Mandatory reporter training is a really good idea. Things like that, all the things that we can do to take this environment that is very new and people have questions about, and make it as safe as possible for every kid. And then McKinney-Vento, if you've never heard of that anytime a student enrolls in school, McKinney-Vento is around homelessness, if I'm not mistaken, Tom, is that right?
Yeah, homeless, or what the term I've heard is like marginally homeless, where might not have permanent residence. Sometimes this is multiple families living in one home. Sometimes this is,
Mhm.
the kid who has had a falling out with their parents, and so they sleep on the couch at a friend's house. Um, but they don't have the same kind of stable environment that enables them to, when they're at school, only think about school. Right? If you're homeless, how do you do homework?
I just had a conversation with a friend of mine from high school and discovered 3 days ago that she was homeless our senior year, was living in her car, working 3 jobs. I had no idea.
Right.
And I think we just never know what people's situations are. And so McKinney-Vento is some documentation that helps schools understand what the needs of those kids are.
Right. And there's federal programs to help get funding for them. Microschools often are not eligible for some of those programs unless they become a registered private school entity and apply for various grants. But that doesn't mean that the students in your schools are not under that
Experience some of
category.
these, yeah, exactly.
Right.
The last thing I'm going to mention is as you're walking through this, just thinking about opportunities for creating community involvement. And there's a lot of ways to define community. And we won't get a lot into that right now because we'll be talking about that later on. But just want to plant the seed of, as you're thinking, how do I define the community of my micro school? And then wherever you define it, figure out how you can expand it, because there are broader communities out there that can support you and your students.
Yeah. And how I can invite my community to serve this sub community within. There's so many resources out there that go unused and needs that go unmet simply because there's a mismatch and a misalignment of needs versus resources. They're there. Like, the resources are there. It's just finding and connecting with them and then making sure that they're getting allocated where they're most needed.
And we'll talk about some of the ways to know about resources that will be available to you. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This has been great.